So, how good are we at treating alcohol and drug addiction? Not very good. Is there a better way? Yes. It's a method that's been around for 50 years. 85 to 90% of the people treated in this program get and stay clean and sober with just one round of treatment and very little relapsing. Stick around until the end. I'm going to prove to you that this program exists and that it works. What you're going to learn just may save you or somebody you care about from the hellscape that is severe active use addiction. Hey folks, if you're new here, I'm Jeff. I was a lawyer in Seattle for 25 years, owned my own law firm. We did a lot of high stakes, complex litigation. I also had a wonderful wife and two incredible kids. That's them in a recent Christmas card photo. Notice who's missing from that picture. I now have great relationships with both my kids, thanks to my ex and a lot of other people. I had lots of money, all the toys, bells, whistles, and professional accolades that screamed success. And I lost it all to this little molecule. 1 oxygen, 2 carbon, and 6 hydrogen atoms that comes packaged in these beautiful glass bottles. I did 4 rounds of rehab spread out over about a decade. That's average for the people who still have the resources to get back to treatment. But rehab didn't work for me, and it didn't work for the majority of the people I went to treatment with. But I got lucky. I escaped only because circumstances forced me into a variant of the recovery system we're going to look at in this video. After I got sober, it finally dawned on my highly trained legal mind that maybe I should analyze the evidence of all the evidence-based treatment I'd received. So I transitioned from attorney into addiction and neuroscience researcher. What I found was not good, but I discovered that there's a much better way. The method that's been used to treat airline pilots, physicians, and nurses for over half a century. The airline industry calls it HIMS, Human Intervention Motivation Study. It's PHPs, or Physicians' Health Programs for doctors and nurses. HIMS started in 1974. Doctors and nurses followed suit and implemented their own version of the program in the early 1990s. We're going to take a look at a snippet of a report done by CBS Sunday Morning on HIMS.
Our pilots are just like all people. They have some of the same shortcomings that any of us could have.
Peggy Gilligan, the former FAA administrator in charge of safety, says a drinking problem is not necessarily the end of a pilot's career.
There are lots of things that initially might disqualify you from being a pilot, but with proper care and treatment, with proper rehabilitation, you can return to the flight deck.
And in fact, for decades, the FAA has been doing exactly that, quietly sending pilots diagnosed as substance abusers back to work. It's called the Human Intervention Motivation Study, or HIMS. And before you panic, consider this. It may be one of the most successful rehab programs ever.
Let me get some of these numbers straight. 80% of the pilots who enter the program don't relapse at all.
That's right.
We're going to stop it here for a second. This video came out in 2018, about 7 years ago. In 2021, HIMS released updated relapse statistics for pilots who entered the program between 2011 and 2021. Here's the latest HIMS relapse report for that group. Only 14% of that cohort relapsed. 86% got clean and sober on the first round of treatment without a single relapse. And we know this data is highly accurate because all HIMS participants undergo rigorous biological testing for alcohol and drugs. HIMS is getting significantly better over time. The traditional treatment model, not so much.
And of those that do relapse, most only relapse one time.
That's right.
And there's never been an issue with a pilot undergoing treatment while flying.
That's right.
Why aren't you screaming this good news from every rooftop in Washington, D.C.?
That's a really good question.
It's not only a really good question, it's kind of a critical question. You can find the link to that entire HIMS video in the description below. It's only 8 minutes, and it is a really good piece. I'd encourage you to watch it. It's a critical question because the dominant treatment model in the US, known as the Minnesota model, isn't very effective. 75 to 80% of us who are treated for addiction in the US are treated within the framework of the Minnesota model. It was developed, you guessed it, in Minnesota in the 1950s. Its primary treatment method or tool is Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous methodology and philosophy. We go to treatment, Our discharge instructions are find a 12-step home group, get a sponsor, work the steps, and develop your relationship with God or your higher power. AA was developed in the 1930s by a couple of alcoholics, Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob Smith, who had no knowledge or understanding of brain function, neurology, or the dopaminergic neural pathways that drive addiction. Back in the 1930s, nobody knew. It wasn't until the late 1970s and early 1980s that the dopaminergic hypothesis of addiction was proposed by Roy Wise, an NIDA scientist who was the pioneer who synthesized prior research and spearheaded what is now the accepted neurological basis of addiction: dysregulated dopaminergic pathways of the brain. Back to Wilson and Smith. Despite their lack of any understanding of the neurological basis of addiction, they did stumble upon some stuff that can be really helpful in reprogramming the addicted brain. Wilson was a masterful promoter, and he did a masterful job of promoting AA as the method to escape addiction. AA became ubiquitous. Today, you can find AA groups or an AA meeting nearly anywhere. I love AA. It was a critical part of my sobriety journey, but it wasn't enough for me. And the evidence is irrefutable. 12-step methods alone aren't enough for the vast majority of us to get and stay clean and sober. That's going to come off as heretical to AA folks, but the numbers don't lie. 12-step methods alone don't get and keep very many of us clean and sober. So what's the evidence of the effectiveness of 12-step centric Minnesota model of treatment as usual? We're going to take a look at the evidence-based studies. The first we'll look at is this landmark 2012 study by this guy, Bill White. Bill's a granddaddy goat of the recovery science field. Unfortunately, he passed in 2021. He analyzed 415 scientific recovery reports from 1868 through 2011. He found that only 30.3% of the people who underwent treatment were clean and sober 5 years after discharge. He also cited to a study that found that 85% of people relapsed within their first year following treatment. Next, we have the new goat of addiction recovery science, Dr. John Kelly of Harvard, who also founded the Recovery Research Institute, a great place for information that you can find on the web. Dr. Kelly and Dr. Keith Humphrey at Stanford authored a meta-analysis study in 2020 looking at the effectiveness of AA compared to cognitive behavioral therapy, motivational enhancement therapy, two additional methods of treating addiction. They found AA was at least as good or superior to CBT and MET in a number of domains, but the numbers for all three methods were horrible. The study found that only 24% of the AA facilitated group maintained sobriety for a year after treatment. It was worse for CBT and MET groups. Only 15% of CBT and 14% of MET participants were sober for the first year after treatment. When averaged, only 20% of the entire study cohort maintained sobriety for the first year. That's an 80% relapse rate in the first year. In HIMS style recovery, 80% of participants never relapse. We'll also look at this 2012 study done by Deborah Dawson. She's been a prolific researcher for the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism since 1990. She found that only about 20% of the people who went to treatment maintained abstinence within the last 3 years following discharge. I'm not going to turn this video into a study of studies. There is some variability in percentages, but the majority of the good research finds abstinence rates between 20 and 30% up to 5 years following treatment. But there's a big glaring problem with the data in this research. It's self-reported data. We're relying on people with addiction to tell the truth about whether they've been clean and sober. Spoiler alert that will come as no surprise to anyone who's ever loved an addict or any of us who've come out the other side of a severe substance problem. We lie about our abstinence status, not because we want to, but because our addictions force us to. I got those post-treatment phone calls and I lied, and so did my friends. There are dozens of studies that have looked at this data problem. Most of them conclude that 30 to 50% of us who've gone to treatment lie about being clean and sober when we've relapsed and gone back into active use. We generally continue to lie until we're so caught that lying becomes useless. So this sets up the revolving door paradigm, in and out of sobriety and in and out of treatment. 60 to 80% of us who relapse go back to baseline use quickly. For the small percentage of us with severe addiction who do eventually get out, it takes about a decade of cycling in and out of sobriety. That decade comes in our 30s, 40s, and early to mid 50s. that time of life where we should be building familial, social, and economic capital. Instead, we tend to lose everything and rack up consequences that haunt us and our loved ones for life. So how do we stop this cycle and get more people clean and sober before the damage is done? With a slightly different approach and an acronym: HIMS. What is HIMS? It's not treatment. It's aftercare monitoring and accountability structures. HIMS participants go through traditional Minnesota model treatment at vetted treatment centers. As soon as they're discharged, they're set up with a monitoring protocol that consists of 3 prongs. They have to comply with any prescribed co-occurring psychological or psychiatric aftercare. They have to attend 12-step meetings at a prescribed frequency in accordance with discharge instructions. And the third prong, the most important piece: HIMS folks are biologically monitored for abstinence over the long term. It turns out that the alcohol and drug testing program has by far the largest effect size in keeping people clean and sober and getting them to self-sustaining abstinent remission. Participants call a phone number every morning. If their random number hits, they go get tested that day. Early on, the testing's frequent, and everybody knows that the testing system is rigorous enough that if you're using, you're going to get caught almost immediately. The human brain is biased towards loss aversion, and getting caught is losing. We really don't want to disappoint families, friends, and employers. We're subconsciously primed to avoid that loss. But in early recovery, the craving monster is screaming at us, shouting, "Hey, there's a really good chance you'll get away with it, and you got to take that chance and use." When craving hits and we see a crack, we have to get sneaky and take the chance. Our neurobiology makes that choice for us, and until that neurology is changed, that choice is ordained. We don't control it. Effective testing for enough time gives our brains enough abstinent time to upregulate D2 dopamine receptors that then diminish and eventually eliminate craving. Abstinence repairs white matter and allows neurogenesis in the hippocampus that eliminates subconscious cues and triggers. It provides the necessary time for long-term neuroplastic potentiation in the amygdala, nucleus accumbens, and prefrontal cortex that then restores brain systems altered by addiction. If we can stay abstinent long enough, our brains change, our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors change, and we can become members of polite society again. If we're effectively monitored, there's a high probability we can stay clean and sober long enough for these brain changes to occur. If we're not, our chances aren't good because it takes time, lots of abstinent time. It takes between 2 to 5 years for the brain to get to a safe place. By about a year of being clean and sober, things are typically much better, but we're still at the mercy of the sneaky craving monster until the dorsal striatum of the brain is solidly revamped. That doesn't happen in weeks. It typically takes many months to years for someone with a severe alcohol or drug problem to get to that space where the brain and nervous system are free. HIMS participants typically stay in the program for 5 years. There are things that can be done that we've incorporated at Vive on that can accelerate and more deeply embed abstinent brain change. But as a general proposition, for someone with a DSM-5 severe addiction classification, it's at least 2 years. Everybody's a little different in their neurobiology and their circumstances. We built a model to compare long-term abstinence success rates under the treatment as usual Minnesota model, contrasted with HIMS-style aftercare support. It's a statistical simulation known as a Markov chain Monte Carlo model. We incorporated numbers on abstinent rates using data from Project Match, NESARC, other data sets, and a number of studies like the ones we looked at earlier by Bill White, John Kelly, Keith Humphreys, and Deborah Dawson. We weighted it to account for underreporting that known phenomenon of us addicts not telling the truth about our use. We also incorporated probabilities of time to return to baseline after relapse and length and intensity of resumed use after relapse based on peer-reviewed scientific studies. Again, weighted for underreporting bias. The weighting is important to get a real-world, boots-on-the-ground picture of reality. My criticism of the addiction recovery scientific literature is its failure to use that weighting and the conclusion it draws on success rates. We know addicts aren't reliably truthful in reporting our clean and sober status. It's misleading not to account for that known truth. So here's the graph. And in the red, we have the linear average of abstinence relapse rates under the traditional Minnesota model of treatment. And in blue, here we have relapse and abstinence rates under HIMS style aftercare. And we'll run some scenarios. So this first one, we've got both individuals, clean and sober. Next individual, as you can see, standard treatment Minnesota model, relapses shortly after discharge from treatment, gets sober again, stays sober for a number of months, relapses again, period of sobriety, relapses, and is clean and sober for quite a while until about 36 months, uses again, and this individual unfortunately looks like they were off to the races. And if that individual, statistically speaking, had gone into HIMS style aftercare, there would have been one short relapse up front and then sustained clean and sober time for the remainder of the 5 years. This person probably got to self-sustaining abstinent remission. We'll run another scenario. Again, you can see a very poor outcome under the traditional model, stayed sober for about 5 months, relapsed for 4, tried again, and this person looks like they then were unable to string together any clean and sober time. HIMS participant, no relapses. Another scenario, and again, an unfortunate look at what happens in traditional treatment, relapsed right after treatment, tried again, relapsed a couple of months, tried again, stayed sober for about 4 months, and had at about the 8-month mark, it looks like about a year of relapse, tried again, and then at about the 20 months, 2-year mark, looks like this individual gave up. If that person, again, statistically speaking, had gone into HIMS style monitoring and aftercare support, there would have been no relapsing. And that person probably gets to long-term self-sustaining abstinent remission. And I'm just going to click through scenarios so you can get a sense. We'll do 20 of them. I'm not going to comment much. So you can get a sense of what relapse and resumed use rates and intensity and duration look like 5 years following treatment initiation under the Minnesota model versus what they look like down here if you've got HIMS style monitoring and aftercare support. So here we go. I'm just going to click through. Good news here, both of them stayed clean and sober. Typical pattern, traditional treatment, and a little blip here in HIMS. But the one thing I will say is when there are relapses in HIMS style programs, they tend to occur very early on. They tend to be very short because people are monitored. They get caught, they have the support, so they get right back into that recovery paradigm. They're not allowed to continue to relapse and go into resumed use state like unfortunately people under the traditional model are. So the duration and intensity of relapse tend to be very short in HIMS style aftercare and monitoring programs. Good news here for traditional treatment, no relapse. Another one. And here we're back to statistically, unfortunately, what we would expect. Again, an individual here under traditional treatment, trying. Again, another one, unfortunately, some sobriety, relapse, some sobriety again after that 1 month relapse, couple months relapsing, tries again for about 3 months, and then looks like this individual gave up. Again, you'll notice down here, we're not seeing any relapsing on this HIMS bar chart. This is our 13th individual, and unfortunately, again, another standard profile after treatment initiation under the Minnesota model. Individual number 14, 15, and we have a typical short relapse that we see in the individuals in HIMS style aftercare that do relapse. Individual 16, 17, and here we have an individual who was not buying into either traditional treatment and or HIMS style program. Now, this individual probably lost their license either as a pilot, a doctor, or a nurse, because in order to continue earning a living in a HIMS program, you do have to comply with abstinence requirements. And this person probably just quit and continued using. And again, another typical treatment as usual profile and another typical HIMS profile with no relapsing. So I'll do 20 of them, but you get a sense. And unfortunately, it doesn't look good. And if you can see here, this is a typical statistical pattern under the Minnesota model. It looked a lot worse than I thought it would. So we tore it down. The entire model, chi-square tested all the data to make sure we had good fitness of data, made sure all of our assumptions were in line with the research, sent it back to the statisticians to say, hey, is this right? And they came back and said, unfortunately, yeah, this is accurate. We also roundtabled it with treatment professionals that we know, and the general consensus was this is what they see on the street. So not good news. We could be doing so much better. If you look up here, I'll go through these lines a little bit. And this is kind of the sad reality. 50% of us will pick up and start using again within a month after treatment. And at a year, only about 15% of us have maintained sobriety. That comes from the study in Bill White's research that I referenced earlier, but it's also in line with what the vast majority of the research finds, and the majority that we've looked at. Deborah Dawson, John Kelly, Keith Humphreys. And then if we look at here, we put 20% at 5 years. And this is not 20% continuous sobriety. This is 20% of the people are sober at 5 years after going through a number of episodes of sobriety and relapse. The research says 20 to 30%. I put 20% because, again, we've got that known data problem. The research relies upon addicts to accurately self-report. And we know that that is not what happens in reality. If we contrast that with the data on HIMS-style aftercare and monitoring programs, this data, we are highly confident, is highly accurate. And how do we know that? Well, we know that because HIMS-style participants are rigorously and continuously drug and alcohol tested. It's exceptionally hard to use in a HIMS-style recovery program without getting caught. And that's one of the effect sizes that makes HIMS-style programs so incredibly effective. So what do we need to change? Actually, not much. The infrastructure is there. We have somewhere around 15,000 treatment facilities in the US. 12-step groups are everywhere, and they don't cost anything. Treatment and AANA can be very effective if we get enough time, but we don't get enough time. And craving drives us right back to using. Craving makes the choice for us early on. It takes at least a few years of being clean and sober and doing the work to give the brain enough neuroplastic healing time to extinguish craving and restore healthy, top-down behavioral habituation in the brain. We know that the magical structure called the human brain controls our behavior. We now know the brain can change, and changing the brain changes our behavior. But the brain resists change, and it is biologically limited in how fast it can change. Craving has the advantage of keeping us locked in early on. The vast majority of us can't beat craving without long-term structures. Hey, trust me, it's a hell of a lot easier to spend the first couple years in recovery support structures than it is trying to white knuckle through craving out in the wild. One question I get all the time, for some reason, comes from medical directors at treatment facilities. And it's, okay, Jeff, this sounds great, but don't they go back to using when the structured recovery support and abstinence monitoring end? The evidence says no. We have a good 2022 study by Lisa Merlot at the University of Florida. She studied physicians 5 years after the end of their PHP programs. 97% were still in recovery, and not a single physician had lost his or her license to practice medicine. So 50 years ago, the airline industry stumbled upon an effective system to treat addiction that is neurobiologically sound, even though nobody knew it at the time. We had to make sure that pilots were sober so they didn't crash planes. And rigorous drug and alcohol testing made sure they went to work sober. But it turns out the long-term rigorous testing was a critical piece that provided enough abstinent time that got the pilots to stable, self-sustaining, lifelong abstinent remission. Since we started Vivon about 5 years ago, we've been supporting and monitoring lawyers and other professionals using HIMS-style protocols. We were told it won't work with lawyers, that we lawyers are too notoriously difficult to get clean and sober. We did it anyway. Well, guess what? It turns out it works. It really works. And we should make it work for everybody. About 1 in 10 of us in the US occupy the moderate to severe end of the addiction spectrum. And contrary to popular belief, only a small fraction of us live under freeway overpasses. The odds of developing a substance use disorder rise with education and income. Add in another paradox. there is good evidence that the more education and wealth an addict has, the lower the odds that that person will get and stay clean and sober. I'll leave you with this. Imagine if we approach cancer the same way we approach addiction. Why would we stubbornly rely on medical technology that's nearly a century old that only gets somewhere between 15 to 20% free of cancer, when there's a newer approach that saves 85 to 90% of the people afflicted with cancer? And bonus, it turns out that the newer approach is much cheaper. What would we be screaming from every rooftop in Washington, D.C.? Hopefully, we'd be screaming, we need to modify the standard of care and do what we know works. If we can fix 85 to 90% of the people with cancer and it's cheaper, it's a no-brainer. If we can fix 85 to 90% of the people with addiction, it should be the same no-brainer. So here at Vivon, we've used our considerable research skills to put together solid information on addiction recovery. If you have any questions, get a hold of us. If you missed it in the video, the link to our website's in the description below. Our phone number's on the website too. Most importantly, if you or someone you care about and love needs help, it is out there. Get the help. Addiction can be overcome, and life on the other side is incredible. Don't get stuck in a recovery paradigm that doesn't work. Get into discovery and discover what works for you.